Welcome to the Books and Music Review Show. And today we have Gerard, who will do a book review. Over to you, Gerard.
Thank you. Yes, today we'll be reviewing a book which describes the early life of former President Ronald Reagan. It was written by Luke Cannon, and it's called Governor Reagan: His Rise to Power. He was the state bureau chief when he worked for the San Jose Mercury News back in the 60s and 70s. And he got to chronicle Ronald Reagan as he made the transition from a neophyte politician, political figure who most people recognized as a Hollywood, as a film star, film and TV star, to someone who was a prominent political force. And he interviewed him multiple times and wound up writing 5 biographies of President Reagan about his time as president and as governor. Ronald Reagan has the distinction of probably having more biographies written about him than any other president in recent memory, with the exception of Richard Nixon. I think one of the reasons is because he had a really, beyond his the influence he had in the political landscape, he had a really fascinating life story. He was born in Tampico, Illinois, but his family migrated throughout the state to all different cities. So, in order to understand him a little bit better, we need to look into his history, which is something that Luke Cannon does in this book. Ronald Reagan was the son of Nell Reagan and Jack Reagan, one of whom was, Jack, his father, was a very garrulous Irish Catholic storyteller who also had problems with alcohol, whereas his mother was a very abstemious, very religious woman whom he credits with helping more inmates than the state of Illinois. So she actually led prayer meetings at her church, the Disciples of Christ. And one of the things he learned a lot of lessons from his parents, both negative and positive. In terms of negative reinforcement, seeing his father struggle with alcohol probably propelled him to be so opposed to it in his own personal life. There's this iconic moment in his autobiography, Where's the Rest of Me?, where he takes his father, who had passed out on the porch steps of his house where they were living at the time, and he drags him in from the snow. That book, the title actually comes from a line he uttered during a movie called King's Row, which is about a group of young people who lived in a rural, isolated town at the turn of the last century, and Ronald Reagan's character, Drake McHugh, was operated on by a sadistic surgeon, and when he wakes up to find he has no legs, he screams, "Where's the rest of me?" And the biography, it's interesting that moment. I think it captures to a certain extent how he blended myth and reality during the course of his life, because that was his main vocation before he became governor. Governor of California. He was He was an actor, and that was something he pursued in high school. Throughout this book, Luke Cannon describes how he had adapted throughout his life to different situations and different circumstances, and I think his early life was shaped to a large degree by his the struggles his family went through because of his father. One of the points he makes in this book is that even before the Great Depression, even before they experienced the Great Depression, his family was poor, traveling from town to town in Illinois, where his father was an itinerant salesman. And in terms of positive values, in addition to the spiritual values his mother imparted to him, his father also gave him a lot of very kind of bedrock principles that he relied upon. He was a very pro-union, before the New Deal came about, basically a New Deal Democrat. And a number of examples are cited throughout the book where to describe the values that he embodied. For example, he was, despite the fact that the KKK was the Ku Klux Klan was prevalent throughout this era, especially after World War II in the Midwest and states in parts of the country like northern Illinois and Indiana. His father refused to let his children see the Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffiths because he was so staunchly opposed to racism. And he had another example is when his father was on the road selling. He refused to sleep in a hotel room which excluded Jews, and also they took in a black family who had been kicked out of a hotel for their race, because of their race. And I think these examples he describes left a lasting impression upon Ronald Reagan. For example, later on in his life, he helped a black basketball player on a teammate of his who had been excluded from a hotel because of his race. He helped him get back into the hotel and slept in the same bedroom with his teammates in order to protest that discrimination. And there are a lot of interesting details about his early life, most of which people probably familiar with the fact that he was a lifeguard from the age of 15. During high school, he's credited with saving 77 swimmers, people who were in danger of drowning. And a lot of the activities he engaged in weren't necessarily academic. Today we have this idea of politicians who are kind of manufactured almost to fit a certain mode. They go to college and they get good grades and graduate with law degrees, become lawyers, and then start running for office or work for other politicians as staff members, and then just gradually work their way up into their elected to public office themselves. And Ronald Reagan's path or trajectory towards public office couldn't have been more different. In fact, he's described as not being an incredibly meticulous student. He relied to a large extent on what some people would call a photographic memory, or in order to recall facts that he would need to remember in order to pass his exams. Whereas he spent most of his time doing things like performing in theatrical productions. He was captain of the swim team. He was involved in football, and when he went to college at Eureka College, he was involved in plays and acting, of course, and also, interestingly enough, he was involved in a student protest, and this presaged what would his work with the Screen Actors Guild. He was involved in a student protest where the students walked out of campus in order to excuse me, in order to extract concessions from a president who he felt who was cutting the budget of needed programs. And the early life of Ronald Reagan is pretty interesting when you look at his career path. So he started his entree into the world of acting, you could say, was when he was hired as a radio announcer for a small station in Davenport, Iowa, broadcasting games for the University of Iowa, and eventually hired by an even larger station in Des Moines, where he would recreate baseball games based upon the telegraph wire. So he probably the most memorable image from this point in his life is where he described a certain play after the wire went dead. He described a play of a batter basically popping up endlessly for however many minutes or fouling off until the wire was restored, and it showed the creativity he had and the imagination that he had in crafting these stories. And this also led him, when he was on the road in California, to an audition for Warner Brothers screen test for Warner Brothers when he was covering baseball games for the Cubs. Originally, after he was hired to do their basically B movies, not very substantive kind of I guess you'd call them fluff today, just films that aren't that important in terms of drama. But eventually he worked his way up to become a bit of a leading man, and with films like the Newt Rockne Story, where he played George Gipp, a dying player on Notre Dame. And eventually, that film earned him his nickname, the Gipper, win one for the Gipper, which would be used later in various political campaigns or political battles he had. And he would become something of a leading man. The problem is that his breakout film, which we mentioned earlier, King's Row, happened on the cusp of World War II. So just as he was gaining prominence as a leading figure in Hollywood, he was forced to enlist in the Army, the motion picture unit, which he credited with putting his career on hold. But something it did do was it led him to become involved much more closely with the Screen Actors Guild, a union of Hollywood actors. And this was the moment where I guess you could say that the seeds of his future political life were planted. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild both at the time and after World War II. During his second presidency, he was largely responsible for the actors walking off and striking until they were able to negotiate a deal for residuals, screen residuals, which essentially meant that actors would be paid when their films were shown on television. This was during the period when television was supplanting large movie studios, and he realized that this was going to be a lucrative market, and that actors should be paid for their work, even if in the future when television was going to become the main medium for most Americans. And another something else that happened when he was president of SAG was the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War began to progress, and he was kind of tasked with the choice of how he should respond to it. He wound up becoming an informant after being initially reluctant, becoming an informant for the FBI. And this was, and more or less forcing he and others were forcing communists who influenced unions essentially out of Hollywood. Something else that happened during that time was that he met his second wife, Nancy Davis, after divorcing Jane Wyman, who he'd been married to for 9 years, even though she never discussed it publicly afterwards. If you read this book, you get the impression that one of the reasons they divorced was his work for SAG. The amount of time he spent working for SAG, and the amount of time he devoted to the political side of Hollywood. So after this period in his life, he began to work for GE Theater, an anthology drama and comedy anthology series run on network television. And here, I think it was here that his basic political opinions crystallized and were shaped further, where he made the transition from being a New Deal Democrat to a conservative Republican. He was hired by GE to basically go around, give speeches. I think 14. To give speeches about 4 months out of every year, and this was where he really refined his political positions in opposition to bigger government and for less regulations. And he also honed his that quality as a public speaker. The idea that he would have to in the future make speeches, stump speeches throughout the country, throughout the state first, and then when he ran for president throughout the country, was something that began when he worked for GE, and eventually he parted ways with GE when they thought he was becoming too political. So he used a lot of these skills to build a base of support, so that he could run for governor, despite the fact that he had no political experience before this. He decided to run against a popular two-term governor in Pat Brown, and the race was very bitter and hard fought. The fact that he was an actor before this was fodder for Governor Brown. In fact, in one campaign appearance, Pat Brown was at a school, and he asked the students, "Do you know who else was an actor?" John Wilkes Booth. And it really was used as a cudgel against Ronald Reagan. But the funny thing is, it actually redounded to his benefit. And Lou Cannon describes this in the book, how Edmund Brown was insulated from this degree, since he came from Northern California and San Francisco. He didn't realize how important Hollywood and the film industry was to Californians. So bashing his opponent for being an actor was ultimately counterproductive, because it didn't take into account the fact that there were many Californians in Southern California and Los Angeles and Orange County who looked on the film industry as a positive. And he did wind up winning that campaign in a landslide, carrying everything but three counties. And his governorship was very tumultuous, since it began in the mid 1960s during the height of the Vietnam War, and student-led protests throughout the state and country. And he was one of the more notable parts of his governorship was the confrontation he had with student groups that occupied campuses in the California university system, in places like Berkeley and the University of Santa Barbara. The fact that the California Highway Patrol and eventually the National Guard were called in to break up these encampments was something that a moment that marked the first term of his governorship. But there were also other important achievements, like stopping the Dos Rios Dam, preserving the John Muir Trail, and a lot of environmental achievements. For example, the redwoods, the idea of preserving thousands of acres of redwood forest rather than cutting them down for timber was an idea that inadvertently he came to embrace, and something that's still a remarkable achievement when you go to Northern California and see these beautiful redwood forests. So after his first term and as governor, and he won re-election, his governorship sort of stagnated a bit, despite the fact that he was a relatively popular incumbent. So when he retired from office and began to write syndicated columns and give speeches across the country, he wasn't really sure what his next step would be. So he began to think very closely about whether or not he wanted to continue in politics, or whether this was simply his fate not to be simply his fate just to be a governor, a two-term governor. He tried to dip his toe into the water in 1968, when there was still a lot of resistance towards electing Richard Nixon, but it was more of a trial balloon than an actual candidacy. What is fascinating about this book is that Luke Cannon explores the political currents that actually propelled him into running for president, not only in 1976 and barely losing to President Gerald Ford, but also eventually his successful candidacy in 1980 as one of the oldest, the oldest person up to that point to be elected president. And it's really worth reading, not only this book, but I guess you would call it the sequel to this book, The Role of a Lifetime, which describes his 8 years in office, because it gives you an insight into not only the political and philosophical ideas that shaped him as a public figure, but also the personal history, and that was so pivotal to forming him as a human being, and how it affected him as he made these important decisions about the environment and criminal justice and the economy. So I would definitely recommend reading this book. Again, it's Governor Reagan, His Rise to Power. And if you have the chance, reading some of his other works about Ronald Reagan, if you have the opportunity, it's definitely, he definitely had a life worth exploring. So if you're interested in politics, or even if you're not that interested in politics, I would definitely give it a try. Read the book. All right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.